Hey, Dr. C here with you. So how do you safely lower cholesterol levels? In a recent video, I talked about cholesterol, heart disease, thyroid disease, how all these things come together and how cholesterol is a common risk as it is. A third, 40% of the population has problems with that. It's clearly tied with heart disease. Heart disease is the most preventable cause of death. And this is amplified greatly with thyroid disease, like 2 to 5 times more greatly amplified. I didn't mention this before, but cholesterol, before we knew about its ties to heart disease, it used to be used to track thyroid function. It was an old thyroid test because they relate so strongly. But last video, I talked all about cholesterol, those connections. This one's all about what to do about that. So we've talked about the whys and what matters. Now let's get into the how and what you can do to make a difference and change that. And the quick takeaway I want you to have is that there are safe, natural things you can do that can make a really big difference. There's a lot of data been done studying this and so much we're aware of, but we can make a big difference and there are things you can do that are effective. The first thing to talk through very basically to recap is being aware of the cholesterol levers. That's how I think about this. There's a couple main ways in which your body is regulating cholesterol. The first one to think about is your liver's role in producing cholesterol. So most of the cholesterol in your bloodstream comes from your liver. And super brief, your cholesterol is working in all these different compartments of your body, your brain, your hormone production inside your glands, your cell membranes, and then it's in your bloodstream. They're all different. So you make it locally where you need it, and the amount in your blood doesn't correlate with how much is in your brain or how much is in your adrenal glands where you're making hormones or elsewhere. But your blood levels, when they're too high, they just cause cholesterol to make plaque in the bloodstream. It's really just that simple. But the main thing to think through is how much we generate from our liver. There's an enzyme called HMG-CoA reductase that our liver uses to synthesize cholesterol. We'll come back to this. That same enzyme also has a role to play with generating CoQ10. We make CoQ10. Most of what we need, we actually make by ourselves. And that's the main enzyme that does that. Now, some things can cause variable amounts of cholesterol to come out of your liver. A big one is genetics. There are overt genetic hyperlipidemia syndromes. So some people genetically make just a ton of cholesterol, like way more than is needed. How do you know if your cholesterol levels are genetic? Well, one, they're really high. Like your total cholesterol is more than 300. LDLs are more than 200. Without knowing anything more, that's pretty much always genetic. It's pretty much always familial, and that's a massive risk for heart disease. Another way to know is that it's not changing a lot. So let's say that you're somewhat high, but you don't go up and down. You really haven't gone up and down throughout the span of your life. In those cases, that's probably a big part of it is under genetics, and it is related to liver production. Now, let's say your cholesterol has not always been that high, but it is now. One of the first things we think about is fatty liver syndrome. So when your liver gets too much fuel, it stores that fuel as fat. It converts it into triglycerides. Now, your liver, one of its big jobs is pulling cholesterol out of your bloodstream and removing it from the bloodstream. It makes it, but it also removes it. But if your liver is all full of fat, it's got no room to pull cholesterol out of your bloodstream. So with fatty liver syndrome, cholesterol levels get a lot higher. And kind of a little detail, but again, you're not making more, but you're withdrawing less. So imagine you've got a sink that has the faucet can't shut off, but then the drain is clogged. So the water overflows. Now, if the drain was open, it wouldn't overflow, even if the water was going really hard. And that's the correlation between fatty liver and blood cholesterol levels. I won't spend a lot of time on fatty liver. I have in other blogs and videos. The short answer is the metabolism reset diet is made to help reset and repair fatty liver. And the cool thing is your liver is resilient. Your liver can repair, can regenerate. So if that's a problem, that often can be just reversed and taken care of. Now, the second big lever to think about is cholesterol on your plate. So what the diet brings to you. And this one's trickier. Early along, we thought that the main thing was just eating cholesterol, which foods have the most cholesterol. What we learned was that it's a little more complicated. So the food highest in cholesterol would be eggs. But dietary egg intake doesn't have a strong correlation with cholesterol levels, except for at the extremes. And I've got to call this out. I see a lot of health experts saying Have 6 eggs each day for breakfast. Well, so it's great to have high quality protein for breakfast. No debate about that. Eggs are very high quality protein. There's not a lot of quantity of protein in eggs, about 6 grams per egg. So if you do 6 eggs, well, that's a decent dose of protein. No debate about that. And the cholesterol in eggs is a type that, because of the other lipids and lecithin-like molecules in eggs, we don't absorb all of it. So it's probably not a concern about just the dietary cholesterol. But, the saturated fat. So that's the biggest culprit. When saturated fats are above a certain threshold, they cause more LDL to form and less of it to leave the bloodstream. So they're not cholesterol, but they cause cholesterol to get a lot higher. And 6 eggs end up being a ton of saturated fats. So yeah, an egg or 2 a day for most people when they're not concerned about iodine, not a big deal, but 6 a day, not safe. So what are your biggest sources of saturated fat? And very briefly, there's different kinds of saturated fats. I won't spend a lot of time on this because this is not totally clear how it affects risk. But the risk appears to be a little lower for some kinds of saturated fats than others. The relevance of this is mostly just for fattier versions of dairy, but not butter. So cheese, yogurt, milk, the fat in those foods may not carry as much risk as the fat in butter or the other sources of saturated fat that I'll talk about. Again, it looks that way, not totally solid, so I'm not going to put a lot of weight on that, but that may be the case. But definite things that are high sources of saturated fat that can be an issue for elevating LDL. So fattier cuts of meat. You know, beef, especially cuts like ribeye, T-bone, and brisket. Pork, especially really fatty versions. Bacon, pork chop, sausage. Fattier versions of lamb, like ground lamb especially. Poultry with the skin, dark meat especially, you're going to get a fair amount. I mentioned dairy products. Yeah, they have saturated fat. The one version of dairy that has the biggest effect upon risk appears to be butter. And then there's ghee or clarified butter, or there's brown butter, which is pretty similar. Those probably have the strongest version of risk. And then there's processed meats. So sausages, hot dogs, salami, pepperoni, purified versions of saturated fat from animals like lard, which is rendered pig fat, or tallow, which is rendered beef or mutton fat, less commonly. Then we've got plant sources of saturated fat. And real briefly, all fat has some saturated fat. Every kind of fat, every kind of oil has some saturated fat. So when you're consuming massive amounts of fat, like the majority of your calories, there's no way you will not get a high amount of saturated fat. Now, some fats have a lot more than others, but again, all types have some. So I want you to know that you can't drink bottles of olive oil per day without getting exposed to a lot of saturated fat. All versions have a fair amount of that. So the highest versions in plant foods are going to be coconut oil, palm oil, cocoa butter, and then some nut butters are a little higher than others, peanut butter, almond. But a big concern really is then processed and packaged foods, because these have fats that often end up oxidizing and becoming trans fats. So pastries, cookies, cakes, and then fried foods. Similar problem here, they oxidize. French fries, fried chicken, donuts, all that. And then snack foods that have a lot of oil, potato chips, crackers, popcorn, you name it. Again, total fat matters. And I want you to hear that healthy fats are not a bad thing. Things like plant-based fats or fats from seafood. Within the context of a healthy diet, when they're somewhere around maybe a third, maybe 40%, probably at the most, of calories, they're great. They're better being there than they are not being there. But if you go really high on any kind of fat, you end up getting a lot of saturated fat. So the idea is have some healthy fats, don't make it the main source of calories, and mostly focus on fats that are unsaturated. Avocados, pretty much all nuts and seeds besides coconut, olive oil, good things. Then we also think about the other facet of diet is how foods can make you absorb less cholesterol or eliminate more cholesterol. So we're eating foods and some of that cholesterol comes into our blood, but then also we poop and some of that leaves with our stool. And the more fiber we're consuming, the less we absorb and the more we eliminate. Super brief thing in this area, soluble fiber, especially soluble fiber from grain products, has huge effects upon this. And lots of studies on oats. Simple thing, but yeah, they're allowed to make claims that they improve cardiac health. They lower the risk of cardiac death because that's been really well documented. So that could be as easy as Cheerios or yeah, definitely oatmeal, steel cut oats. If you really want to amplify the effects to help with cholesterol, you can do oat bran. And this is something we heard a lot about back in the 80s. You know, it didn't go by the wayside because it didn't work. People just got bored, I guess, or thought about other things. But there's massive data about oat bran being helpful. And most of your bigger health food stores or online retailers, you can find oat bran, and you'd use it just like oats, like rolled oats. It's a little different in terms of taste and texture, but you cook it the exact same way. You add like 2 parts of water, you know, get some water boiling, add the oats, let it simmer for 5 minutes, and you're good to go. And the taste and texture are pretty much just like oats. So really easy to get down. There's also some good data about plant stanols and sterols. These are things that act kind of like hormones from plants, and they help us absorb lower amounts of cholesterol. These are found in many foods. Flax seeds have those especially, and there's purified forms of those in some margarines. There's like newer generations of margarines that don't have trans fats, but do have plant stanols. And these are also proven to lower cholesterol. They're reasonable options. So that's about cholesterol on the plate. Now, the next big lever is about your muscles. So your muscles withdraw cholesterol from your bloodstream. And the shortest story here is that the more they're engaged, the more you're sweating, the more they're going to pull cholesterol out of your blood. Now, all kinds of exercise are great, no types are bad, but if you're starting somewhere, you'll get the most bang for the buck with regular aerobic exercise. You know, walking, running, cycling, hiking, dancing, whatever. This has a huge effect upon increasing the activity of the muscle's LDL receptors, not only lowering cholesterol, but to a degree even greater than the degree on which it may affect cholesterol, it can lower the risk for coronary artery disease. So yeah, I can't say enough positive things about the benefits of regular exercise. All versions help. So yeah, strength training is good as well. But in terms of your time commitment and how much time you have available, if you're not doing anything, start with cardiovascular training. And ideally, most days you would do half hour, 45 minutes at a moderate to challenging intensity. And then some days you would do something that's more like a HIIT or interval workout. That might be once every other week if you're just getting going, maybe twice a week if you're really into it, and then once a week something longer to where it's hour, couple of hours, lower intensity, you know, all very relevant. Now, also about cholesterol, there's good data that your hormones matter. Now, this video, I'm not going to talk as much in depth about that because I have in so many others, but if you've got problems with your hormones, like your adrenals or your thyroid especially, you've got to manage those. You've got to make sense of those. You can't walk around with high thyroid antibodies. You can't run around with too little thyroid hormone. You can't take thyroid meds that you don't need, and you can't take massive doses of thyroid medication. Those are all things that are problems both for cholesterol and also secondarily straight to heart disease. One more thing to mention for a big lever, the stress load, you know, the role of stress and inflammation. This is big, and many people, just your subjective experience of stress, it can measurably change cholesterol, and even independent of that, it has huge effects upon heart disease. You know, one study showed that if your cortisol cycle is not working right, that may be a bigger risk factor for cardiac death than high cholesterol or smoking or diabetes. So that's big. Short version of that, take a look at the Adrenal Reset Diet. That helps you know if this is a factor for you, if so, which of the levels you might be in, and then what you can do about that with lifestyle, because that can be changed and there are good things that can be effective. So those are the main lifestyle considerations. Now we think about more so interventions, about like medical interventions and things that are done to lower it directly. And here, there's the things used in conventional medical worlds, and there's also then the idea about natural compounds. And this comes to play for those who have done a lot of lifestyle efforts, but their total cholesterol will not go below 200, or their LDL will not go below 100. And again, general numbers, if you've got high lipoprotein A, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, high C-reactive protein, a big family history, you might need better targets than that. You might need even lower cholesterol levels to keep your risk significantly in check. But those are at least good starting places. So yeah, quick recap, think about your diet being focused on whole grains, fruits and vegetables, lean proteins, some healthy fats, really limit saturated fats and trans fats, and really minimize foods dense in cholesterol. Think about at least 150 minutes of exercise per week, maintaining a good body weight. Even a little weight loss can make a huge difference for cholesterol and heart disease risk. If you smoke, you gotta quit. If stress levels are not ideal, you want to make the big changes. Where you work, who you're with, what your passions are, they need to align with your values. And if they're not there, they've got to shift. Now, overall, lifestyle changes, they can change cholesterol by 5%, 20%. They're different for different people, but they can do quite a bit. So if those don't take you all the way there, then we think about cholesterol lowering agents. In the cholesterol world, that's mostly going to be statin medications. Now, here's the thing, they work. They lower cholesterol, they can lower the risk of heart disease. No real debate there. But the problems with those is that they have side effects. There are those that get muscle pain, there's fatigue, digestive problems. There may be a higher risk for type 2 diabetes, which is terrible. There are also those who can get cognitive side effects like memory loss or confusion. And then a lot of people don't like the idea of needing a medication long term. They wish that lifestyle or natural compounds could do more. So yeah, if someone does tolerate statins, have no problems with them conceptually, and they work well for them, that's a reasonable option. There's probably more benefit than there is harm. But for many, that's not true. Many do get side effects. Many don't prefer to be on a medication. So what else is there? Well, a lot of natural things have been studied over the years. Niacin, polycosanol, all sorts of things. But the difficulty is that some things don't work. They don't lower cholesterol. Some things do lower cholesterol but don't affect heart disease. And some things work, but they have massive side effects. Niacin is kind of an interesting one. Niacin lowers cholesterol. The latest data now suggests it might raise the risk of heart disease. And there's also a thing called niacin maculopathy. There are old doctors, but there's no old, bold doctors. Over the course of many years, you hear these things that sound like they would never happen, but you see them happen when you practice long enough. Way back in the 90s, niacin was having a moment, and there was data suggesting it was very helpful. I was prescribing special forms of niacin to help people lower cholesterol. One man almost lost his vision from that. And his ophthalmologist talked to me and said, yeah, this is a thing called niacin maculopathy. And I had never heard of it. I read up on it. I'm like, oh, wow. If you actually take enough to lower cholesterol, it's a risk factor. It's a problem for that. So I've been burnt before. And I've seen a lot of things that seem promising, but don't really pan out. So there's a lot of things that I won't talk about. But the main thing that I will talk about is red yeast rice. We've got really good data on this. This is a product made from fermented rice and a special type of yeast used for that called Monascus purpureus. The fermentation gives kind of a reddish color and it makes a lot of biologically active compounds. The biggest one is one called monocolin K. And this is something that's kind of like statins, but it's probably a little bit easier tolerated by the body. So it acts on the enzyme HMG-CoA reductase. That's the one your liver uses to generate cholesterol. And red yeast rice can slow that down. Now, at present, we have evidence showing that red yeast rice can lower cholesterol, can decrease the risk of heart disease, and has a very good safety profile. Even further, there have been studies that have taken people who had bad reactions to statin medications. They took statins, they had side effects that were significant. These same people were then given therapeutic doses of red yeast rice. They did fine with that with almost no exception. Almost all still tolerated it very well. So it's well tolerated, it's lower in side effects, even among those who had had side effects from statins. Now, that's enough right there. I'd be good with that. But there's a few more pretty cool wins. I mentioned how statins have a problem for raising the risk for diabetes. We've got data that red yeast rice lowers the risk for diabetes. It decreases the risk for metabolic complications. And to date, we've got more than 30 high-quality studies showing that it definitely lowers the risks of heart attacks and cardiovascular events. But there's also some other side benefits besides that. I mentioned the one there about the decreased risk of metabolic diseases. We also know that Triglycerides can get lower. A1C can be decreased as well, which is a longer-term risk for diabetes and more of its complications. But it also has some overall effects of decreasing inflammation in the body. And we know that chronic inflammation is behind so many problems. Here's a big one. There's evidence saying that things that lower cholesterol, they may improve TSH levels. They may improve hypothyroidism. So when cholesterol production is decreased, the thyroid can work more effectively, and there's less of a brake put on the thyroid from the liver. So this could be a benefit for red yeast rice. We've got data on bone health showing that red yeast rice can help build bones and increase bone density. So many people that have cardiovascular risks and are thinking about that are also concerned about their bone density, and that's totally valid. I mentioned before briefly about diabetes. That and heart disease go hand in hand. So far, the studies on red yeast rice suggest that it can decrease the risk substantially by 20% or greater. Again, we contrast that with the risk about statins, saying it can raise the risk for diabetes by 9 to 12%. So we see that what it does is that it decreases how the body processes negative side effects from carbohydrates. It causes the body to make less of these harmful glycosylated end products. Cancer risks. Again, good thing about lower inflammation. We've got some data on how red yeast rice acts upon colon cancer cells. They showed that it inhibits their growth, so we could decrease the risks that way. Now, nothing is perfect, so what are the drawbacks? Well, there's some thoughts about it may affect vitamin K levels, and that's true for statin drugs, so it's thought that maybe it's true for red yeast rice as well. If you're taking red yeast rice or a statin medication, you want to consume vitamin K. MK7 is a spectrum form of vitamin K that includes other types. I've used that in Thyroid Daily and my other multis. You also want to get a good range of leafy green vegetables. That can compensate for any losses. I mentioned before about how the enzyme HMG-CoA reductase is correlated with CoQ10 production. In theory, red yeast rice could lower CoQ10 production. I recommend taking some CoQ10 along with red yeast rice. There's a red yeast rice formulation I've made, and that includes CoQ10 to compensate for that. And one of the last big concerns, there's a compound called citrulline, and this is a mycotoxin. So when red yeast rice is formed under poor quality control, you can get a range of fungal compounds that formed. Some of them can be bad. This is especially a problem for red yeast rice that's formed outside of the United States, especially in China. So you want to make sure that red yeast rice is measuring for citrulline and making sure that it's pretty much negligible. But overall, this compares really nicely to statins. The cholesterol reduction, 30 to 50% for a statin, probably 10 to 40% for red yeast rice. 20 to 40% reduction for LDL, probably 20 to 30% reduction for red yeast rice. So when this is done with lifestyle changes, you can see the same sort of benefit you would see from statin medications. One small benefit statins might have is just fewer pills per dose. That's about it. Costs are probably lower in most cases for red yeast rice. And the other big perk is that it's lower in overall side effects and even well tolerated by those who have been intolerant of statins in the past. So that's the main message. Cholesterol is something that you should be aware of, you should screen for, and you should manage. Do the lifestyle steps, they all matter. And the tough part is that they lower your risk of heart disease, even if they don't have as big of an effect upon cholesterol. So let's say you're someone to where you exercise and that didn't change your cholesterol. Keep exercising. Even if it never changes your cholesterol, it still decreases the risk of heart disease. And that's true of pretty much all those other lifestyle changes I mentioned. They're all going to be good for you in a lot of ways, and they often lower cholesterol, but whether they do or not, they're still good. So do those lifestyle things full on. If those are not enough, think about really changing your diet directly. Add in some oat bran, really reduce the total fats, the saturated fats. If cholesterol is still above target, red yeast rice is a great option to safely lower that. And this is especially critical for those with thyroid disease, because this is the most controllable cause of early death that we really have. All right, Dr. C with you. That's it about lowering cholesterol and managing it. Please check yours. Please tell this to others. Please know that it is real. There's a lot of talk in natural medicine denying cholesterol, but it's real. It's a real risk. And like all things, be educated, be thoughtful, and take good care of yourself. What you do does matter. All right, we'll talk again real soon. Bye-bye.